On March 4th, 2024, a white Toyota Camry rolled into my bay at 7:43 in the morning with a vibration so bad the driver's hands were shaking before he even opened the door. He had already been to 2 shops. The first told him he needed new engine mounts. The second told him he needed a full tune-up, new coils, new plugs, the works. Total estimates between them were just over $1,400. He sat across from me, looking like a man who had already accepted that cars were just designed to steal from you. I asked him one question. Had anyone checked his crankshaft position sensor? He stared at me like I had spoken a different language. 20 minutes later, the shaking was gone. The car ran smoother than it had in 2 years, and the part responsible cost less than $40. Today, I am going to show you exactly why this happens, what this sensor actually does inside your Toyota engine, why it fails silently and invisibly, and how to confirm it is the cause of your shaking before you spend a single dollar on anything else. Because this sensor is the most misunderstood and most overlooked component in the entire Toyota drivetrain. And once you understand what it actually controls, you will never ignore it again. Here is the reality most Toyota owners never hear. The shaking you feel is not random. It is not bad luck. It is not evidence that your engine is dying. In almost every case I have seen, violent vibration in a Toyota with no check engine light, or worse, a check engine light that comes and goes, traces back to one of 2 things: corrupted data or a failing sensor that the engine control unit has not yet fully condemned. And the crankshaft position sensor sits right at the center of both of those problems. I have been working on Toyotas specifically for a long time. They are some of the most reliable vehicles ever manufactured, which is exactly why when they shake, owners panic. Because Toyotas are not supposed to do that. When something goes wrong, drivers immediately assume the worst. They assume internal damage, worn bearings, failing mounts, cracked flex plates. They assume the car is telling them something catastrophic. But in reality, the engine is not broken. It is lost, and that distinction is everything. Your engine does not run on instinct. It runs on signals, dozens of them arriving thousands of times per minute from sensors positioned throughout the engine bay, the exhaust, the intake, and buried deep inside the engine block itself. The crankshaft position sensor is not just one of those signals. It is the foundation. It is the timing reference every other system depends on. Without accurate input from this sensor, the engine control unit cannot calculate ignition timing, cannot sequence fuel injection correctly, cannot manage misfires, and cannot coordinate the relationship between the crankshaft and camshaft. When this sensor drifts, degrades, or begins to fail intermittently, the engine does not shut down. It stumbles. It misfires at random intervals. It hesitates under load. It vibrates in a pattern that feels mechanical but is entirely digital. And the cruelest part is that it almost never throws a clean, obvious code. At least not at first. The driver who came in that morning had already had his codes pulled at an auto parts store. He showed me the printout. One misfire code, cylinder specific, already cleared. Nothing else. The shop that saw it replaced the ignition coil on that cylinder. The vibration came back 3 days later. The second shop replaced the spark plug. Same result. Because neither shop asked the right question. They treated the symptom. They saw a misfire on one cylinder and replaced parts on that cylinder. But the misfire was not caused by a bad coil or a bad plug. It was caused by the engine control unit receiving corrupted timing data and firing the wrong cylinder at the wrong moment. The ignition system was fine. The sensor feeding timing information to the ignition system was not. This is the trap that costs Toyota owners thousands of dollars every year. And it happens because the crankshaft position sensor fails in a way that most diagnostic software is not designed to catch on the first pass. Here is how this sensor actually works and why understanding it changes everything. The crankshaft position sensor sits near the bottom of the engine, usually positioned close to the crankshaft pulley or the flywheel, depending on the engine family. In most Toyota 4-cylinder and V6 applications, it monitors a toothed reluctor wheel that rotates with the crankshaft. As each tooth passes the sensor, it generates a voltage signal. The engine control unit reads the pattern of those signals and uses them to determine exactly where the crankshaft is in its rotation at any given millisecond. That information tells the engine control unit when to fire each injector, when to trigger each ignition coil, and how to phase the camshaft timing through the variable valve timing system. On engines with Toyota's VVTi or dual VVTi systems, accurate crankshaft position data is even more critical because the system is constantly adjusting cam timing dynamically based on load and revolutions per minute. If the crankshaft signal is degraded, the entire variable valve timing calculation becomes unreliable. The engine feels rough at idle, hesitates under acceleration, and stumbles when the system tries to advance or retard timing. The engine control unit cannot compensate for missing or corrupted crankshaft data the way it can compensate for a slightly lazy oxygen sensor. Timing is not adjustable. It is either correct or it is wrong. And when it is wrong, even briefly, the engine misfires. Multiple cylinders can misfire in sequence if the timing signal drops out for even a fraction of a second. And that is exactly what a failing crankshaft position sensor does. It does not fail completely, not at first. It drops out. It hiccups. The signal degrades when the engine is hot, when ambient temperature is high, or when the sensor has accumulated enough internal resistance from heat cycling over years and miles. This is why the vibration in so many Toyotas is intermittent. It is not always there. Some mornings the car starts perfectly and drives without a single shudder. Other mornings it shakes at idle and stumbles on the highway. Mechanics who check it on a good day find nothing. Owners go home convinced they imagined it. Then it comes back. And every time it comes back, it is a little more frequent, a little more intense, until eventually it becomes constant. By that point, most drivers have replaced 2 or 3 other parts chasing the symptom. And I have seen the aftermath of that process more times than I can count. What makes the crankshaft position sensor particularly dangerous from a diagnostic standpoint is how Toyota's engine management system handles the failure. Because the ECU relies so completely on this signal, it is programmed to be very cautious about condemning it. A single dropout does not always set a code. It might log a pending code internally, one that never appears on a generic scan tool. It might set a misfire code on whichever cylinder was active during the signal loss, making the problem look specific to one cylinder when it is system-wide. It might not store any code at all if the dropout was brief enough that the ECU recovered within its detection threshold. This is why misfire codes on Toyotas that keep returning after parts replacement should always trigger a crankshaft sensor investigation before anything else gets touched. The code is pointing at the effect. The sensor is the cause. Now let me tell you how to confirm this before spending $1 on the repair. The most reliable method without expensive equipment is a combination of 2 checks, a visual inspection, and a heat test. Start with the sensor itself. On most Toyota 4-cylinder engines, including the 2AR-FE, 1ZZ-FE, 2GR-FE, and 3MZ-FE families, the crankshaft position sensor is accessible without major disassembly. Locate it near the crankshaft pulley or the transmission bell housing, depending on your specific model and year. Inspect the connector first. Crankshaft position sensor connectors on high-mileage Toyotas are notorious for heat damage, cracking insulation, and oxidized terminals. A connector that looks clean from the outside can have internal corrosion that creates exactly the kind of intermittent resistance that causes signal dropouts. Disconnect the connector, inspect the pins, and check for any sign of brown discoloration or brittleness in the wiring near the sensor body. Next, perform the heat test. This is the step almost no one outside of professional shops knows about. Crankshaft position sensors fail thermally. The internal magnetic components and wiring inside the sensor degrade over time, and that degradation becomes measurable only when the component is hot. Cold engines with failing sensors often start and idle smoothly. Hot engines with failing sensors shake, misfire, and stumble. If your Toyota shakes primarily after it reaches operating temperature, or if the vibration appears and then disappears as the car warms up and then worsens again, that thermal pattern is the signature of a sensor that is failing internally but has not died completely. The professional confirmation is a resistance check with a multimeter. With the sensor disconnected and the engine cold, measure resistance across the sensor terminals. For most Toyota crankshaft position sensors, a healthy reading falls between 985 and 1,600 ohms, depending on the specific application. Then start the engine, let it reach full operating temperature, and shut it off immediately. Measure again while the sensor is still hot. A good sensor holds close to the same reading. A failing sensor will show a significantly different resistance, sometimes dramatically higher, sometimes dropped to near zero. That change in resistance under heat is the proof you need. It costs you nothing but a $15 multimeter and 30 minutes of patience. If the resistance shifts more than 15 to 20% between cold and hot, replace the sensor. If the resistance is already outside the specification when cold, replace the sensor immediately. The replacement itself is straightforward on most Toyota applications. Start by disconnecting the battery. Locate the sensor. Remove the single bolt holding it in place. Disconnect the electrical connector. Then reverse the process with the new unit to install it. Apply a thin film of clean engine oil to the O-ring on the new sensor before installation. Torque the bolt to spec. On most Toyota engines, that is around 8 Newton meters or about 6 foot-pounds. Do not over-tighten. The sensor body is not designed to handle torque beyond that, and cracking it means starting over. After installation, clear any stored codes, reconnect the battery, and perform a proper idle relearn. Toyota engines need time to recalibrate after this sensor is replaced because the ECU stored adaptive corrections based on the degraded signal. Start the engine and allow it to idle undisturbed for at least 10 minutes. Do not touch the throttle. Do not run the air conditioning. Let the ECU rebuild its baseline from clean, accurate data. Then take a gentle drive, steady throttle, moderate speeds, and no aggressive acceleration for the first 15 to 20 miles. The relearn period matters. Skipping it leaves the ECU running on old assumptions, and the car may still feel slightly off even though the repair was done correctly. Most drivers who do this correctly describe the result the same way. Not only does the shaking stop, the entire engine feels different, more responsive and cleaner, like a car that woke up. And that description makes sense when you understand what was happening before. The engine was misfiring constantly at a level the driver could feel, but the ECU was barely catching it. Combustion was irregular. Fuel was being wasted on cycles that never completed cleanly. Power was being absorbed by the vibration instead of transferred to the wheels. After the sensor is replaced and the relearn is complete, all of that disappears. The engine runs on accurate data for what may be the first time in years. There is one more thing I want you to understand before you walk away from this video. The crankshaft position sensor is not just a part that wears out. It is a part that fails silently while other parts take the blame. Ignition coils get replaced. Spark plugs get swapped. Fuel injectors get cleaned. Engine mounts get condemned. And throughout all of it, the real cause sits undisturbed, still generating a signal that is just good enough to keep the car running and just bad enough to make the car feel wrong. Shops that do not test thermally miss it every time. Scan tools that only read active codes miss it every time. Owners who trust symptom-based diagnosis without understanding the underlying data architecture get handed estimates for repairs they never needed. I have seen this play out in Corollas, Camrys, RAV4s, Tacomas, and Siennas across 4-cylinder and V6 platforms, on vehicles with 60,000 miles and vehicles with 280,000 miles. The sensor does not discriminate by model or mileage. It fails based on heat cycles and time, and most Toyota owners never know to look for it until they have already spent money on everything else. You are not in that position anymore. You know what to look for, you know how to test it, you know what the results mean and what to do next. And you know that the shaking you feel is not the sound of your Toyota giving up, it is a data problem with a straightforward solution. Before you leave, drop a comment if your Toyota has ever shaken without a clear explanation. Tell me what shops tried to charge you for. Those stories matter, because every driver who reads them saves money they were about to spend on the wrong repair. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing this kind of breakdown, the kind that gives you real diagnostic knowledge instead of just sending you to a parts counter. The most expensive Toyota repair is not the one that actually needs to happen. It is the one that gets approved before anyone checks the right sensor.